Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, where those videos are available to watch anytime afterwards. And if you've not already done so, please silence your cell phone. Our new temporary exhibit of rarely shown flags from the MDAH collection has opened upstairs in the FedEx Exhibition Hall. Admission to the exhibit is free, as is admission to the museums for History's Lunch attendees. And we are excited to welcome back Eddie Glaude Jr. on the evening of Thursday, April 4th. He'll be in conversation with the former director of these museums, Pamela Jr., about his new book, We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For, and we'll have copies of his books for sale. Tickets are now available for the Mississippi Freedom Seder, which will take place on Thursday, April 11th, and is co-sponsored by the Goldring-Woldenberg Institute of Southern Jewish Life. Inspired by the original 1969 Freedom Seder, where hundreds of people of different backgrounds gathered to explore and celebrate freedom in the context of the civil rights movement, this communal event invites participants to the Passover table for an evening of commemoration, stories, and community building. You can find details and purchase tickets on the MDAH website. Finally, I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch, when we will be joined by Sean Lambert, who will present Around the Big House, Understanding the History of Enslavement at Prospect Hill. Today, I am delighted to welcome Emilye Crosby to present Anything I Was Big Enough to Do, Women in the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. Here to say a few words about her is Sarah Campbell, Deputy Director of our Programs and Communication Division, and also Emilye Crosby's sister.
Thank you, Chris. What a pleasure it is to introduce Emilye Crosby, my big sister, to you in this space.
Nobody can hear.
Nobody can hear? Is that better? All right. I was just saying how much pleasure it gives me to introduce my big sister, Emilye Crosby, to you in this space. Many of you have visited the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, some of you many times, and learned some of the stories of incredible fortitude and clarity of purpose of local people who formed the backbone of the movement. Some of the scholarship underpinning those stories is Emilye's. And I know March is Women's History Month, a great excuse to bring Emilye home from Rochester, New York. But March is also known for basketball madness. So I thought I would share a photograph or two of Emilye from 42 years ago when she was the starting point guard for the Port Gibson High School Lady Waves, a team that won South State and played in the Coliseum. It was around that time that she had her first formal teaching about the civil rights movement. Those who know Emilye know she brings the same passion and drive to her work as she did to basketball. She's proudest of her teaching awards and her efforts with the SNCC Digital Gateway and the SNCC Grassroots Organizing Series with HBCUs and Black History Museums. Emilye is always looking for ways to make sure that the history of the civil rights movement doesn't stay isolated in the academy, but is taught in junior highs and high schools so that it can ignite a passion for history in each succeeding generation. Welcome, Emilye.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was great. Or Batmite, as if we're going to talk about basketball. It's just wonderful to be home, and I'd like to recognize and acknowledge some of the people from Port Gibson who got me started years ago, as well as my family. So I appreciate James Miller and Kenneth Ross, and everybody who made the movement possible and who makes the history of the movement live today. I wanted to also, thank everybody at the Department of Archives and History for making this possible, And just, you know, I say this everywhere I go, but the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum is the best in the country, hands down, no question. It's just a wonderful, wonderful museum, and I'm always so happy to come back and visit it again. For my talk today, I'd actually like to start by acknowledging the recent passing of Dory Ladner. She was a remarkable woman and a fierce freedom fighter. Dory was born in Palmer's Crossing outside Hattiesburg. She attended Jackson State and graduated from Tougaloo after dropping out a few times for movement work. Growing up, she was part of the NAACP youth branch, and in the aftermath of the Freedom Rides, she leaped at the chance to work with SNCC, the focus of my talk today. And I think probably most people know SNCC, but SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was born out of the sit-in movement, and by summer of 1961 had begun to work in Mississippi on voter registration. I'll talk more about SNCC, but just wanted to make sure everybody knows what I'm referring to. At a SNCC 50th anniversary gathering, Dory talked about the assassination of Medgar Evers and how she responded. I'd like to play a little clip of that.
And they made the left at Farish and stopped at the Collins Funeral Home and said, "Oh, hell no. Oh, no." And so we're going to go past the Capitol. So I started singing, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine all on North Capitol Street," and started running back up towards North Capitol to make a statement that we were not going to allow him to be murdered and take it as a natural death, bury him, and go about our business. Oh, hell no, no. Because this was an atrocity that had been perpetrated. It was terrorism, and we had to make a statement. You have to make statements. So I arrested myself that day because when we got up to North Capitol and Farish, they had thrown the police line across, brought the dogs out. I jumped into the paddy wagon.
So it's hard to follow Dory. Maybe I should rethink that. But, you know, one of the things that I really appreciated about Dory was her insistence that you had to act, you had to do something. Even when the odds were against you, you had to step up, even when it could be dangerous. And as everybody here knows, some people, like Medgar Evers, paid the ultimate price. Dory was actually mentored by 3 African-American men whose lives were stolen because of their movement work. Medgar Evers, but also Clyde Kennard, who was convicted on trumped-up charges of stealing chicken feed because he wanted to complete his education at what is now the University of Southern Mississippi at a time when white officials were clinging to segregation. For those of you who don't know about Mr. Kennard, he was a military veteran and a University of Chicago student before coming home to help his mother on the farm. He died of cancer shortly after being released early from Parchment. Dory's third mentor was Vernon Damer, a prosperous farmer who was an early and assertive advocate of black voting rights. His house was firebombed shortly after he went on the radio urging African Americans to register to vote and offering to pay the poll taxes of anyone who needed help. He shot back at the attackers long enough for his family to escape, but he died of smoke inhalation. The stories of all these people and many others are told very well in the museum here, and I hope that the next time you visit the exhibition, you think about what it must have been like for Dory Ladner to be mentored by these men and also lose them. It's also important to note that all 3 of these men chose to mentor Dory and her younger sister Joyce at a time when we might have assumed that men would prefer to invest their energy in young men, or when they might have thought that as young women, Dory and Joyce needed protection instead of encouragement to ask. And so this is a good place to acknowledge that the gendered expectations of the society at the time did impact the movement. But the movement was also a place where women and men ignored and challenged societal expectations. One of the things I always appreciated about Dory was that she didn't let anything, whether that was, just anything, but especially societal expectations, stand in her way. This isn't where I'd planned to start my presentation when I was invited to join you, but I did want to acknowledge Dory. I miss her. I wish she was with us. I'll talk more about her in a little bit. So this audience, I'm sure, is more informed than most, but if I ask my students or a general audience to name women who were important to the civil rights movement, they generally can't come up with very many names. They're often stuck after Coretta Scott King and Rosa Parks. It probably isn't surprising that both of those women, as important as they might be in their own right, were associated with Dr. King. This lack of knowledge about women in the movement is especially troubling since, as you may know, women were at the heart of the civil rights movement. In most places, women participated in larger numbers than men and joined earlier than men. There were always exceptions, but that was the general pattern. And this was true even though in some instances men remained more visible as speakers and as leaders with titles. For example, in Claiborne County, where I was raised, out of the first 1,500 people to register to vote after the Voting Rights Act, 80%, or 1,200 of them, were women. Despite this, when it came to marches, the NAACP's Charles Evers implied that women needed protection, typically asking men to march in front and back with women and children in the middle. In a court-protected march that limited the number of participants, Evers asked for ministers and businessmen to demonstrate with everyone else waiting on the sidelines. So this shows how gender-based assumptions could show up. But this kind of behavior was rare in SNCC-related projects. In general, women did everything that needed doing in the movement, whether that was cooking and creating a family-like atmosphere, or trying to register to vote when it was incredibly dangerous and almost impossible to succeed. Women talked to their neighbors, they brought in friends and family, they went to mass meetings. They also spoke up and took on leadership roles, although most of that is missing from our popular understanding. One man recalled, quote, "They quicker to do the work than the fellas." In the 1950s, all the best-known movement activists in Mississippi were men, and many of them remained crucial in the 1960s. But when SNCC began organizing in Mississippi, they brought a different approach and opened up possibilities for women and other groups that had been overlooked. SNCC grew out of the sit-in movement that swept the South after 4 African-American students at North Carolina A&T sat in at the Greensboro Woolworths on February 1st, 1960. By April, there had been sit-ins in more than 70 southern cities, not Jackson, or anywhere in Mississippi yet. To capture and build on this energy, Ella Baker called a meeting of the student leaders. When the sit-in started, Baker was 57 years old. In our society, which tends to devalue older women, I think that's worth pausing and reflecting on. She was 57. She had spent more than 3 decades working and struggling for a more just world. And when college students started the sit-in movement, she was in a position to support and nurture them. And she helped some of them move from what was a spontaneous action into an organization that was committed to radical, long-term grassroots organizing and political activism in some of the most isolated and dangerous places in the rural South, places here in Mississippi. In the 1940s, Baker traveled the South organizing and supporting NAACP branches. She developed an extensive network among activists across the country. In the mid-1950s, she was one of several people who urged Martin Luther King Jr. to form an organization to carry on the work of the Montgomery bus boycott. She very reluctantly became the executive director of that organization twice. She struggled with the group's sexism and its insistence on building up King as the leader. And she was actually on her way out. She had resigned when the sit-in started, but she was still, working her last couple months. But she convinced Dr. King and SCLC to host a meeting of the student activists. Baker thought it was important that the young people have their own organization and even their own opportunity to make mistakes. Although she turned down formal roles with SNCC and typically stayed in the background, she was absolutely crucial to the organization. SNCC quickly adopted many of her beliefs, including a preference for collective leadership and decision-making and an opposition to charismatic or hierarchical leadership. You can see why she and Dr. King might have struggled with each other. She had a belief that, quote, oppressed people, whatever their level of formal education, had the ability to understand and interpret the world around them, to see that world for what it was, and to move to transform it. That's a quote from her biographer, Barbara Ransby. Baker also thought, and this is Baker, quote, people have to understand that they cannot look to salvation anywhere but to themselves. Most important, Baker and SNCC approached organizing with an emphasis on developing leadership and helping people reach their full potential. This helps explain why SNCC was so much more open and receptive to the involvement of women and young people, more so than any other group at the time. The fact that SNCC was an organization of young people also helped. They ignored or rejected many societal norms. By choosing to participate in sit-ins, the young people often had to challenge or ignore their parents or other adults like the school officials at their universities, as well as segregation laws. In some cases, the young women had to violate curfews just to participate in planning meetings. Dory Ladner recalls that when she and her older sister Joyce were students at Jackson State, they had to sign out to leave campus. They would say they were going shopping when they were really going to meet with Medgar Evers. This opened them up to discipline for lying, but if they had said where they were going, they wouldn't have been allowed to leave. It would be hard to overstate Miss Baker's influence on SNCC, but at the same time, the young women who joined the organization insisted on their right to participate, to make decisions, to lead, and no one was going to stop them. For a variety of reasons then, related to youth, to Miss Baker's influence, and more, SNCC was more open to women than any other organization at the time. SNCC also helped launch the women's liberation movement and inspire wide-ranging changes in our society related to gender as well as race. But this extensive involvement of women was not inevitable. In Mississippi, the first field staff was almost entirely male. When Bob Moses began a voter registration project in Macomb in summer 1961, there were a few women, including Diane Nash from Nashville, the Nashville movement, Chicago originally, and Ruby Doris Smith from Atlanta and Spelman. But the majority of the early field staff and the ones who stayed the longest were men. This numeric dominance by male field staff was also true when SNCC moved into the Delta to begin organizing in summer 1962. Given what we know about the importance of women to the Mississippi movement, it makes sense to ask, why were these early field secretaries so often men? One big answer is the gendered assumptions of the era. Scholar Charles Payne describes the way SNCC entered many towns in the Delta, quote, as reminiscent of the Old West, with one or two marshals coming to clean up Dodge City. At the same time, most people were probably more accepting of the idea of young men going alone into such dangerous circumstances and ones that required they find their own place to live, often with strangers. One of SNCC's first field workers, Sam Block, for example, had to sleep for a while in an abandoned car after he was evicted from a couple places. But if we only look at the ratio of male dominance in the number of field staff, we'll miss important aspects of the work and the ways that women were central to it. At the community level, SNCC men were clearly open to women's participation. This is evident in the people who joined and in the male workers' descriptions of women and men. In reading reports and letters by men in SNCC, there are very few noticeable differences in how they talk about the men and women they're working with and recruiting to the movement. For example, Bob Moses' letters from a summer 1960 recruiting trip, as well as field reports from Albany, Georgia, and the Mississippi Delta, tend to describe potential workers, leaders, and voters without appearing to privilege or prefer men or women. They focus on concrete attributes, most often strengths, with occasional reference to potential weaknesses. And while they might mention gender in passing, it doesn't appear to be a fixed positive or negative in their assessments. When they do distinguish between men and women in their reports, it's often to highlight the particular contributions of women. For example, Charles Sherrod described Mama Dolly, who he and other SNCC workers stayed with in summer 1962 in southwest Georgia, as, quote, a gray-haired lady of about 70 who can pick more cotton, slop more pigs, plow more ground, chop more wood, and do 100 more things better than the best farmer in the area. In Terrell County, they stayed with Carolyn Daniels. According to Sherrod, she is the mama for us there. There is always a mama. She is usually a militant woman in the community, outspoken, understanding, and willing to catch hell, having already caught her share. The importance of women also shows up right away in SNCC communications. For example, early reports from Mississippi mention that some men were being fired or threatened, not because of their work, but because of the movement work of their mothers and or their wives, especially around voter registration. The other thing that's important is that as soon as SNCC started working in communities, women and girls jumped and joined into the movement. In Macomb, more of the early leaders were men than women, but when SNCC left the community, 2 college-aged women, Emma Bell and Maddie Bivens, left with them and became 2 of SNCC's first 4 women homegrown staff workers in the field. The other 2 came through Megger Evers' network of NAACP youth branches, Dory Ladner and Colia Liddell. As early as December 1962, in a report to Wiley Branton, Bob Moses wrote that although they did not have a meeting place, quote, each week some person will let us hold a meeting in her home. At present, Mrs. Irene Johnson and Mr. Joe McDonald have opened their doors to us. We feel that others will do the same when they feel a little more secure. I don't know if you caught that, but in a sentence referring to men and women, Bob Moses used a female pronoun to reference their potential hosts. And, you know, I haven't seen anybody else in that era do anything like that. And Moses did it all the time, using female pronouns for a generic movement supporter. I'm not going to talk much about the sit-ins here, but in many communities, college-aged women were just as active as men and insisted on their right to participate. In general, the sit-ins and early organizing make it clear that SNCC's approach to building the movement and challenging white supremacy would open up unusual space for women, space that women helped create and then use to propel the struggle and their own development. To give you more of a sense of women in the Mississippi movement, I'll talk about a couple of the women, and I could talk about hundreds, but I'll just talk about a few and some important themes. Diane Nash was one of the first and most visible women to step forward in the first wave of sit-ins. And in fact, you could just say she was one of the most important people in SNCC's early history. Nash was a beauty queen growing up in Chicago. As a Fisk student, she joined nonviolence workshops and emerged as a leader of the Nashville sit-ins. She was also one of 4 SNCC members, 2 women and 2 men, who joined students in Rock Hill, South Carolina for 30 days of jail no bail on the first anniversary of the sit-ins. This was one of SNCC's first actions as an organization. The Rock Hill arrests and jail time also marked the end of Diane Nash's efforts to juggle school and the movement. Though she was a second semester senior, she recalled that after spending a month in jail, quote, the Chaucer classes became unbearable. Sorry, Dad. And she believed the movement needed the services of a full-time person. A few other students had taken jobs for civil rights organizations after graduating or being expelled, but I think Nash was the first to choose to leave school for the movement. By this time, the SNCC coordinating committee was trying to hire a field secretary, somebody to travel around and start talking to people. And they tried several times to convince Nash to take the job. They would say, we want Diane to do it. And she would say, no, I'm not interested. But Diane, would you reconsider? No, I'm not. And they really pushed. She refused, probably because she was so immersed in the Nashville movement, and the SNCC job wasn't particularly well defined. Nash was in that position when CORE, reeling from vicious attacks in Alabama and under pressure from the Kennedys, considered calling off the Freedom Rides. It was Nash, more than anyone else, who insisted that the rides must continue. She said that if violence stopped the Freedom Rides, the movement was essentially dead. She recalls She quickly began rallying students to make the journey to Montgomery to carry the rides forward. As the students made plans, they turned again to Nash and they asked her to coordinate. She wanted to join the ride. She thought that was easier. She felt just tremendous pressure being responsible, as she said, for the lives of other people. And being on the Freedom Rides coordinating committee was one of the most terrifying things she ever did. But in that position, Nash was steadfast in the face of adult skepticism. She talks about being asked, being told, oh, you young people, you don't know what you're doing, this is dangerous. And she's like, we just wrote our wills. We know what we're doing. We know what we're up against. She pushed back against the unrelenting pressure of the Kennedy administration. They would try to talk to Dr. King, but Dr. King wasn't making decisions, and so Diane was really the person they had to deal with. She directed the resumption of the rides from Nashville and then relocated here to Jackson when it was clear that most participants would be arrested and released here. In addition to helping with logistics, she began holding nonviolent workshops and organizing support among local Mississippians. As this suggests, in spring and summer 1961, Nash was a major player in SNCC as people began to talk about the need to leave school and put off jobs to work full-time in the movement. SNCC was also talking about the possibility of moving their focus from nonviolent direct action to voter registration. There was a lot of debate which came to a head at an August 1961 meeting where the group almost split in two before Ella Baker convinced them to stay together with two wings, a direct action wing and voter registration. Excuse me. Nash was highly suspicious of voter registration and was probably the most significant person in rallying the direct action wing, so it's not surprising that she was named leader of that group. She and some others interested in direct action tried to build on the work they had been doing in Jackson to support the Freedom Rides and build a nonviolent movement in Mississippi. They called it Move on Mississippi, or MOM. It actually wasn't very successful. Some of the people that Nash tried to recruit ended up working with SNCC on voter registration, and Nash herself was arrested for contributing to the delinquency of minors for encouraging young people to use nonviolent direct action. Nash shocked her co-workers by marrying fellow activist Jim Bevel in late 1961. Around the same time, Bevel left SNCC and began to work with SCLC, King's organization, which was really a better fit for him, with more room for charismatic leadership and better pay. Nash and Bevel relocated to Cleveland, Mississippi, where they lived with NAACP activist and SNCC mentor Amzie Moore. And ironically, by this time, Nash is actually working on voter registration. When SNCC started their voter registration work in Macomb, within a couple months, one of the first people they worked with had been murdered, Herbert Lee, in broad daylight by a state legislator who never had any repercussions. And at that point, it was obvious to SNCC that, as they said, voter registration was as a direct an action as you could take in Mississippi. So early in 1962, Nash was married, she was pregnant, and she had charges hanging over her head. She was convicted for those contributing to the delinquency charges and was in the midst of appealing. And she had read the appeals bond, and she said, when the court went in session, she thought she was supposed to show up. So she calls her NAACP lawyer and says, I'm supposed to show up, right? And he says, oh, no, they always tell me when my clients need to come. Don't worry about it. I'll let you know. And Nash calls him again because she's read the appeals bond, and it says she's supposed to show. And they go back and forth. He's like, no, little girl, it's okay. Well, she was right, and basically because it was a civil rights case, they hadn't informed him. And so by her not showing up, it meant that she forfeited the right to appeal, and there was an arrest warrant out for Nash. So now Nash has to decide, is she going to turn herself in and face 2 years in prison in Mississippi, or is she going to leave the state? And in the wonderful book by SNCC women, Hands on the Freedom Plow, she talks about how she struggled with this decision and really meditated on it. And when she came to a decision, she said that many people assumed that her husband, Jim Bevel, had pressured her to make the decision that she made. She says, quote, When a number of people discovered that I was getting ready to go and serve that sentence, they would say, "Oh, Reverend Bevel, you shouldn't make your wife do that. That's too much." Even though both of us would try to say that he wasn't making me do it, some people remained convinced that he was. I imagine these people thought a woman was incapable of making a decision like that on her own. Instead of considering me a person with a brain and my own relationship to the Creator, they thought of me only as the Reverend's wife. Whoops, wrong way. The judge eventually dismissed the charges, probably to avoid the external scrutiny. It didn't look good. But Nash served several days in jail for defying the segregated seating in the courtroom. She says, "I'm about to go away for 2 years. I'm not going to sit in a segregated courtroom." She describes really pretty horrendous conditions and no allowances for her pregnancy. She wasn't allowed her vitamins, for example. She also describes the incredible fatigue she felt the night before she turned herself in, as Ann Braden, another movement worker and mother of young children, worked through the night to type up a statement and press release. Nash issued a public statement asserting, quote, "This will be a Negro child born in Mississippi, so wherever he is born, he will be born in jail." Despite the male pronoun, Nash gave birth to a daughter, Sherry Lynn. I recently ran across a letter from Nash to Ann Braden thanking her for sending an article about her daughter. Nash explained that her husband, Bevel, was suggesting that if she ever faced jail again, she should just get pregnant. I got the impression that she wasn't particularly thrilled with that strategy. Meanwhile, in summer 1962, SNCC's communications director, Julian Bond, told people that Nash was on maternity leave, and Nash made a number of speeches in Chicago and Detroit to help SNCC with fundraising. But really, from this point on, her close association with SNCC was ending. She continued to make important contributions to the movement, but many of them were in conjunction with or through her husband, Jim Bevel, and his job with SCLC. Nash's experience with SNCC was unusual, but I think it's still very important in suggesting the ways that gender does matter, but not in simplistic ways that it's often portrayed. So some people say Diane Nash is evidence of sexism in SNCC because she never had an official title. And I think that's really not a very accurate portrayal of the dynamic. And then other people point to Nash's importance as evidence of the space for women, and I think that's closer. But again, I do think there's some nuance. And there are people that say that Nash was marginalized in SNCC. If she was marginalized in SNCC at all, I think it had more to do with her views on nonviolence. She believed in philosophical nonviolence, and pretty quickly most people in SNCC approached it more as a tactic than anything else. But most of all, I think it's, for Nash, I think marrying Bevel and giving birth to a child were the most important factors in her moving away from SNCC's inner circle. I haven't had a chance to actually check this, but in the SCLC papers, but SCLC staffer Andrew Young wrote in his memoir that while Bevel was on staff, SCLC treated Nash as if she were a minister's wife, expected to work without actually being on the staff. He added, quote, "No small measure of what we saw as Jim's brilliance was due to Diane's rational thinking and influence." So Nash was, somewhat unusual, I think, in SNCC women and women in Mississippi, again, in large part because of her commitment to philosophical nonviolence. Jean Wheeler Smith, standing here, later Smith Young, she was a black Howard University student who came to Mississippi in spring 1964, was probably more typical. She was initially based in Hattiesburg, where she encouraged people to register to vote, attend mass meetings, sign up for the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. The first MFDP meeting in Hattiesburg was particularly memorable. Jean described a growing feeling of panic when her boyfriend, another SNCC worker, was late, and then she realized he wasn't going to make it. At first, she was paralyzed. She couldn't imagine running that meeting. And she looked up to him as this, SNCC star. But it was clear that in Hattiesburg, the women and the men in that community expected her to lead. And in the face of their expectations and encouragement, she stepped up and did. Miss Woods, an older woman she was staying with in Hattiesburg, told Smith, quote, "Don't wait on no man." Once Jean started, she got caught up in the day's work. 50 local people voted in the MFDP precinct meeting, and Jean, who was elated, delivered the ballots to Jackson. She explained that, quote, "That was the day I became an organizer in my bones." I think that's a more typical experience for SNCC women. There was work that needed to be done, and they just did it. There was no one else, they did it. And people throughout the community and the organization expected them to do it. I was just doing a presentation with Judy Richardson, a SNCC person who worked on Eyes on the Prize, and she said, she proposed running a residential freedom school. And, she said, "I'd never done that. Why would anybody think I could do that or would know how to do that?" But she went to a couple of her SNCC male colleagues, Ivanhoe Donaldson, and he said, "Whatever you need me to do, I'll help you do it. I'll raise some money." Stokely Carmichael said, "You want me there? I'll be there. Just tell me when and where." And she said that kind of support made her feel that she could do anything. And that was a kind of a common sentiment among SNCC women. But you may have noticed that Nash said that, people assumed her husband was telling her what to do, and Wheeler is saying, they're pushing me to step out there. So what explains these contradictions? Why these different experiences? And I think, part of that has to do with, maybe Nash being married and to a minister. That may give people a different sense of her. But I think it's just also a reminder that there is no one single experience. I think we might also ask, let me say one other thing about Jean Wheeler Smith. She was working in Hattiesburg, and then SNCC was organizing Freedom Summer, and she went to Miami, Ohio, where they were doing the training workshops. And as you know, 3 civil rights workers disappeared and were killed. And while they were missing, when they were initially found, gone missing, 2 carloads of SNCC people drove to Philadelphia, Mississippi to look for their colleagues. And Jean was one of the people who went. And she says, "Nobody said I shouldn't go because I was a girl." And when, they didn't find them, but they still wanted to have a presence in Philadelphia. So she volunteered. Instead of going back to Hattiesburg, which was relatively safe, she stayed in Philadelphia and worked that summer. And so I also think it's interesting. Here's somebody who was afraid to run a meeting, wanted her to wait for her boyfriend to run a meeting, but she's searching in the dark in Philadelphia for colleagues that she knows are dead, and she knows that could happen to her, and she stayed in that very dangerous place. So it's not always easy to predict what somebody might find hard to do. But Jean Wheeler summed up her experiences saying that she and other women could, quote, "do anything I was big enough to do" in SNCC. Bernice Johnson Regan out of the Albany movement had a similar observation. She said, quote, "If you wanted to go in the field and somebody didn't want you to go in the field because you were a woman, that was their opinion, but it never stopped you from doing it. I'm not describing an organization where men were progressive when it came to women and they were for women being equal. I'm not saying that. I am saying that the structure of the organization was such that you were the only person who could limit what you did, and you had to find the courage to challenge anything that didn't feel right to you." So Nash and Wheeler represent the kind of young women who came into Mississippi as part of SNCC, but more typical and more important probably were the local women, younger and older, from Mississippi. And I'm sure all you know that Mrs. Hamer is one of the most important and visible of these women. Mrs. Hamer attended a mass meeting in Ruleville in 1962, and when SNCC encouraged those present to try to register, she volunteered. She was 54 years old, a sharecropper and a plantation timekeeper. Out of a group of 18 people who went, she was one of only 2 allowed to try to register. On the way home, the bus driver was arrested. The lawman said the bus was too yellow, looked too much like a school bus. The SNCC field secretaries were being detained by the police, and the local people were on the bus, and Miss Hamer started to sing. Bob Moses said she just sang every church song you could think of. And they couldn't really talk to the SNCC people and the local people were separated, but later they went and tried to find who she was. When she got back to the plantation where she'd lived and worked for 18 years, she was told she had to take her name off the list or leave in the morning. And as many of you know, she said, "Mr. Marlowe, I didn't register for you. I was trying to register for myself." She didn't wait till morning. She left that night. She stayed with friends. She had to leave her husband and two children behind. They had to bring in the crop. And then they too were kicked off the plantation. Her friend's house was one of several that was shot at a couple weeks later. She left the area for a couple of months trying to think about what to do, and then she just came back and she was in the movement for good. She said, quote, "I decided all they could do was kill me, and they have been doing that a little bit at a time for a long while." Hamer worked in the movement at a lot of levels. She canvassed for voter registration among friends and neighbors who respected her as a leader. She taught literacy and citizenship classes with her 6th grade education. She spoke at mass meetings. She faced constant retaliation, harassing phone calls, a $10,000 water bill for a house without running water, economic deprivation because no one in her family could get work. Historian Todd Moy points out that Mrs. Hamer's, quote, "first priority as a public figure was to make sure that her neighbors, many of them desperately poor and ill-educated, had clothes to wear, access to decent health care, and enough food to eat. As she understood it, having the bare essentials of life was a human right that could be guaranteed only through political organizing." Mrs. Hamer is also known for her work with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party in 1964, where she was part of a delegation of mostly black Mississippians. It was primarily composed of those who, because of their socioeconomic status and gender and race, were typically excluded from politics and decision-making in our country. The delegation represented Ella Baker's ideal of democracy and was one that challenged not just racists who wanted to exclude African Americans, but most politicians and middle-class liberals. The head of the NAACP didn't really think too kindly of Mrs. Hamer's role in all of this any more than, Eastland. Well, maybe, he wasn't as bad as Eastland, but he also had some issues with it. Mrs. Hamer's vision was clear, uncompromising, and in her testimony before the Credentials Committee, she said, quote, "If the Freedom Democratic Party is not seated now," and I know most of you know this quote, "I question America. Is this America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because we want to live as decent human beings in America?" When others pushed a compromise and tried to bully the Freedom Democrats, Ms. Hamer stood firm. I love this picture of her on the Meredith March. So Ms. Hamer is a great example of Ella Baker's beliefs about the importance of oppressed people having a say in their own lives, and an example of how that translated into space for different kinds of people to be leaders with SNCC's work in Mississippi. After Atlantic City, Mrs. Hamer continued to work with the MFDP. She established a Freedom Farm to provide housing, food, and decent work for people in her community. I want to switch gears a little bit and give you another example of how gender played into some of this. Charlie Cobb, who spent a couple years working in the Mississippi Delta, most of it in Sunflower County with Mrs. Hamer, says he found it much easier to maintain nonviolent discipline when he was being personally attacked than when he saw others, especially women and children, being attacked. He also recalls that initially, when for a brief period SNCC's Delta field secretaries were all men, they heard that Dory Ladner and Colia Liddell were coming to join them. This small group of men began to discuss two related questions. One, could they maintain nonviolence if their female companions were attacked? And two, whether the women should come. In recalling this, he laughs, and he adds that before they could get anywhere in their discussion, Ladner and Liddell were in the Delta working, and none of the men were going to tell them they couldn't be there. And if you've met either of those women, you would understand why they weren't going to say anything. When I asked SNCC Field Secretary Ivanhoe Donaldson about this, he explained, quote, "You see a woman get hit and you suddenly want to go over there and gut the guy. Remember, my dad brought me up. So there were times when everything in your body had to go in reverse to stop you from getting yourself killed. So it was a lot of that in SNCC." He continues, you know, we came up through a history where black men allowed their women to be raped and beat up. We can quibble with that a little, but I was determined I was never going to participate in something like that, and yet I was participating in something like that. Because all you can do in a demonstration when someone gets hit is to try to intervene with your body. But you also have to respect that they're co-partners in this, not a subsidiary category of person that had to be nurtured and protected. As the sisters would say, they would protect us. They did the work, so it was kind of hard not to get the message. He talks about doing nonviolent workshops, and he said he would tell the guys, quote, you need to cover your body over the sister's body, so you took the blow and she didn't. You know, the sisters would say, well, we can do that. We can cover you guys too. While there was a broad humanistic concern among movement activists, and many women were determined, as Ivanhoe notes, to take on the same role of protector that men were claiming, many also appreciated the care that their male colleagues took. Dory Ladner says that Charlie Cobb and the others, quote, were as protective as they could be. They would sort of look out for us. She said they would ride in the trucks and go into the fields with sharecroppers while the women stayed behind to canvass in town. I asked if that bothered her, and Dory Ladner said no. There was no fighting for things to do because all of it was treacherous. So if they felt they could handle this better, fine. I'll go out and knock on some doors and try to organize. So no, it was never a conflict. And the division of labor was whoever. We slept together. It was just we were all neutral in terms of gender. Making it clear that she never thought twice about whether she should be in the field because she was a woman, Ladner says those early movement workers were, quote, totally focused on what we were doing, trying to liberate our people. So I think that this kind of gives a sense of, yeah, gender's there, but it's not going to dictate. Ivanhoe said, motion really sort of always governed in SNCC, and women ran out and ran projects and did stuff. Because we're having the discussion didn't mean that we were either for it or against it. Motion defined what we did, and SNCC people stayed in motion, and they did what they did. And it didn't stop the concept of the conversation, which was in some ways significant and important. But, you know, while you're talking, the work is going on. So I think that we have just a lot to learn from SNCC and the way it was open to the potential of everyone. It challenged all kinds of limitations, and one of the places it really opened doors was for women. And so I could say more about that. SNCC, I didn't bring this into the presentation, but SNCC also was one of the really significant triggers of the women's liberation movement. And so if anybody has questions, I could talk about that later. But at this point, I'd love to take your questions. Thank you.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
And I just wanted to say on behalf of my former boss who perished in a house fire, Herman Leach, he truly appreciated your work on many unsung heroes, and especially his mentor, Rudy Shields,
thank you.
whose gun is in the Civil Rights Movement Museum.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate Mr. Leach and his work. And he really shared a lot of important information about Rudy Shields. Rudy Shields was one of those incomparable organizers in Mississippi. He worked in the Claiborne County movement. He worked throughout Southwest Mississippi and Yazoo City. And yeah, he's an important person to acknowledge. Thank you.
Fannie Lou Hamer is my personal Mississippi civil rights heroine. In December of 1963, I had the good fortune to sit in federal court and watch her testify when she had been abused by law enforcement officials in Montgomery County. At the end of the trial, all of the law students knew she was telling the truth and that law enforcement was lying. The judge knew that, and the jurors knew that. And yet they were found not guilty, and she is truly an example of someone speaking truth to power.
Thank you for that brilliant presentation. Um, in the Delta, particularly, there is much poverty, a lot of ignorance, and so the need for improvement, especially for the women who were essentially backward and not, there's not much education. And so much work was required for them to improve themselves socially. The need was great because of the poverty and the ignorance that existed there. And the local women did a lot of the work because there was much segregation and that kind of problems that existed there. The women did a lot of the work in terms of in the early 1960s when the civil rights movement gained momentum. And there's a lot of people who feel that the amount of work that the local women did, they didn't get the recognition apart from Miss Hamer. There's not a whole lot of other people who did a lot of work who didn't get the recognition that they deserve because because perhaps they were ignorant and they didn't have the academic qualifications that some of the people who came to assist them got. And so to what extent do you think that there's any truth in that kind of feeling that the women, the local women who did much of the work didn't get the recognition that they deserved, and that is mainly because of the ignorance and because of the poverty or because of the illiteracy that existed there at the time. Of course, you got to remember that there was still sharecropping and other kinds of economic problems that existed there.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right that community women have not gotten nearly enough recognition. I think that there's a tendency to, look at the people who stand up in the front and, the speakers, the people who have named positions, and many of them in the movement were men. In Mississippi, women had more leadership roles, more visible leadership roles in communities and statewide compared to any other state in the country, I would wager. And I think that has a lot to do with SNCC's approach. But even so, SNCC's work in Mississippi doesn't get the recognition that it does. So if you look at textbooks, for example, they tend to focus on Mississippi when it comes to James Meredith and Freedom Summer, and they do very little on the voter registration work. They might mention Ms. Hamer, they might mention Bob Moses, they might mention the MFDP, but even then it's really rare. And so I think that there's a tendency to look at this kind of top-down history and privilege it, and SNCC and women both get left out of that history. So I absolutely agree. I think this museum does a remarkable job of pushing back against that, and it's one of the reasons why I love it so much.
Hi, Dr. Crosby. Thank you so much. I was curious, after hearing your presentation and doing a lot of work on women in SNCC, a lot of confusion that comes up with the Waveland Conference in November 1964. And can you just talk about that position paper that comes up about women's discomfort and issues they were having in the movement? Yeah, so after Freedom Summer, SNCC had a lot of things to kind of sort out. They're dealing with the aftermath of the MFDP challenge, and it didn't go exactly the way they'd hoped. Freedom Summer brought so many white volunteers, which changed the dynamics on projects. It was a huge expansion. SNCC thought everybody would leave and go home, but a couple hundred white volunteers stayed and joined SNCC staff. So that just about doubles the staff. It changes the racial dynamics on the staff. And, all of this raises all kinds of issues. So in November of 1964, SNCC has a big staff retreat at Waveland on the coast. And as part of that, people were invited to write position papers about any and everything they wanted, and SNCC would discuss them. And a number of women in the organization wrote a position paper and submitted it anonymously. Pretty quickly, everybody knew that it was spearheaded by Mary King and Casey Hayden, two white women with a long history in the organization, and then some others. And they wrote a list of things, and they, said that they pointed out what they saw as gender discrimination in the organization. Based on, conversations they've been having, feminist literature they've been reading, and, examples that they had picked up. And because of this, a lot of people have looked at that and as a kind of a snapshot and said, okay, well, that means SNCC was a sexist organization. I think, there's nothing that they said that wasn't true, but it's only a partial snapshot. And if you talk to them, they would even say that themselves. Mary King has written eloquently about this in her memoir, Freedom Song, and Casey Hayden in a number of pieces in Hands on the Freedom Plow and elsewhere. That, SNCC really gave them opportunities, and Ella Baker actually mentored both of them on a YWCA project. And so what they say really is it was the contradiction between the openness and the possibility of SNCC and the existence of this still lingering discrimination that they found troublesome and they wanted to raise. But race is also a huge factor in it. So white women in Mississippi were much more restricted than African American women because white women's presence brought danger because of, white Mississippians' craziness about the potential for interracial sex and seeing everything in those terms. And so white women, I think, felt somewhat constrained. And I think, Mary King and Casey Hayden, it was one thing to work in the office when everybody did, but as there's an expansion, I think then they're kind of pushing against that a little bit. And people point out the fact that this is largely written by white women. There's another, there's so much to this, but there was actually have a picture of this? Yeah. In January of 1964, so almost a year, about 10 months, 11 months before the Waveland thing, this group of women that worked in the Atlanta office in SNCC decided that they were tired of women only doing the minutes at the meetings. And Judy Richardson is right here, and she says, we would have these 4- and 5-day meetings that would go for 12, 14 hours, and I would write everything down in shorthand. And she has this diary, and she said typing minutes, still typing minutes, more typing minutes, minutes. And so the women are like, no, we don't want to be the only ones doing the minutes. And so they held this sit-in for Jim Foreman, and then he brought himself into the picture. And Judy says, after that, it changed, and, we weren't the only ones doing the minutes, not because the men just decided they wanted to do minutes, but because we insisted. She said they didn't do them very well. But so, that's a great, I think that's a really important, the Waveland position paper is really important, but I think too often it gets isolated without the larger story. So thanks for the question.
I find the whole thing very interesting. But what always stands out to me is when you talk about the gender issues in the movement, no one really gets into the complexities of the male-female dynamics. And I know Stokely Carmichael made some negative statements in terms of his view of how women could best serve the cause. And there was the male chauvinism and the masculinity issue was very prevalent, and that was another reason for the friction in the movement. But when it's kind of implied in the presentations, but no one really gets to the root of that.
You know, that comment by Stokely Carmichael that's infamous, the position of women in the movement is prone, referring to the sex of Freedom Summer or the supposed sex of Freedom Summer. You know, he made that comment at the Waveland gathering after the position paper. And, you know, people have very different interpretations of that. Mary King and Casey Hayden, who wrote the paper, who were there that day, they took it as a joke. They found it funny. Now, you know, other people have taken it as a serious comment. A lot of people have said that Stokely Carmichael was one of the men who was most receptive to women's leadership. He appointed women as project directors in the 2nd Congressional District where he worked. But I talked to a couple other women in SNCC who said, yeah, it might have been a joke the first time, but he thought it was funny and he brought it up later and it was less funny then. And so I think that there is a lot of complexity to all of this. But certainly the women that I've talked to who worked with Stokely really felt that he was a good person to work with.
We have come to the top of another hour. We have copies of Emily's book, A Little Taste of Freedom, which, when it came out, won the Mississippi Historical Society's Best Book of the Year award. Don't forget, we have Eddie Glaude Jr. Thursday of next week. Come back for History's Lunch on Wednesday with Sean Lambert. For now, help me thank Emilye Crosby for this fantastic program today.
While people are headed out, if I could just mention one thing. My sister said that I'm working on this NEH grant, and if I could plug it, we're working with the museum here. We're working with Tougaloo. We'll be here, I can't remember exactly, but in the next year or so. But meanwhile, we have an upcoming event at Howard that includes a live stream, and we'll have an online conversation. You can go to this website, or you can use that QR code, and you can find information about these events. And I would love to have people from Mississippi joining us. There'll be a total of 5 additional live streams and 5 additional virtual conversations that people can join, as well as a 2-day gathering at Tougaloo and a workshop here at the museum. Thank you.